Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Today I want to talk about a chapter written by Arata Hamawaki called Cartesian Skepticism, Kantian Skepticism and Two Conceptions of Self-Knowledge. And in this article, Hamawaki is going to present to us two kinds of skepticism, Cartesian and Kantian, and then he's going to use that as a sort of way to distinguish or start talking about two conceptions of self-consciousness, one of which is the source of skepticism and is wrong, and another of which is allows us to escape from skepticism. And although Hamawaki doesn't pretend that he has a perfect proof of it, nevertheless the article gives us some reason to believe that this second way of thinking about self-consciousness is correct and is the one that we need if we want to make sense of ourselves. So this chapter, Cartesian Skepticism, Kantian Skepticism and Two Conceptions of Self-Consciousness, appears in a very massive book called The Logical Alien. The Logical Alien books. Edited by Sofia Miguens, mostly filled with writings of James Conant. So there's an article by James Conant at the beginning, and then several authors, including Hamawaki, react. And then there's the largest part of the book is James Conant reacting to the things that came before. But I'm just going to focus on the Hamawaki chapter in this particular video. So let's start with these two types of skepticism, Cartesian skepticism and Kantian skepticism. What's the difference? Well, we start with Cartesian skepticism, and for ease of presentation, I'm going to focus only on external world skepticism, even though Hamawaki, for instance, also spends several pages talking about skepticism about other minds. I'm going to talk about external world skepticism exclusively. So Cartesian skepticism about the external world basically starts from an indistinguishability claim. Right? The claim is this: there are two things that could be the case, and we can't distinguish between them. And because we can't distinguish between them, we don't know which one is the case. And the two situations are these. One, my perceptual ideas, like the things that I experience, could be caused, that's option one, they could be caused by an external world that's just like those ideas presented to be. Right? I have experiences of tables and books and stuff like that. They could be really caused by tables and books in the external world. Or option two, they could be caused by something else. Anything. Madness, a demon, a neuroscientist, who knows? But they could be caused by something very different from what they present to me. And because I can't see the difference, there's no way for me to know which of these two scenarios is the true one. And so I have no reason to believe that there is an external world. Right? I don't know whether there's an external world. I don't even really have a reason to believe that there's an external world. So that's terrible. I lack knowledge. Kantian skepticism, and Hamawaki takes this term from James Conant. And of course, both Hamawaki and Conant are inspired by Kant and Kant's ways of thinking and criticizing Descartes. Kantian skepticism is a sort of strange state of mind which you're led into when you take Cartesian skepticism seriously and then think it through to its logical endpoint. What the Cartesian skeptic assumes as unproblematic is that my perceptions seem to be about an external world. Right? It seems to me that I experience like tables and lamps and computers and books out there. Right? It doesn't just seem to me that I have some internal episodes. It seems to me that I have experience of these external things. But at the same time, the Cartesian skeptic points out that, whatever I really have, right, these awarenesses that I have, could just as well be caused by an evil demon as they could be caused by this external world. Kantian skepticism is the state of mind that you get in when you think, how is this possible? Right? If my perceptual ideas are completely separable from an external world, right? So they're not really awareness of an external world, they're just internal mental episodes that could be caused by anything. And, as soon as I reflect, that's something that I can see. I know about this indistinguishability. Well, how can it be that they seem to be about an external world? How is it possible for my perceptual ideas to suggest that they are about an external world if there is this separation between the world on the one hand and my ideas on the other hand? That seems to be impossible, right? If there really is a separation between the world and my ideas, if I could have the exact same ideas even if the world didn't exist, then it seems unintelligible that my ideas could so much as seem to be about the external world. And this is a strange position to be in because, okay, we now sort of, by thinking through Cartesian skepticism, become convinced that our ideas can't even seem to be about an external world. But, they do seem to be about an external world. But they can't seem to be about an external world. What we're losing grip of here is not some knowledge that we thought we had. It's our own self-understanding. Right? It's our own self-understanding as beings who have perception, who have certain ideas, that have certain contents that we experience in certain ways. That is sort of disintegrating. And if you really were to be able to embrace Kantian skepticism, you would probably end up not being ignorant, you would end up being sort of mad or something like that. So, because Kantian skepticism disintegrates, and because it seems the logical conclusion to draw from Cartesian skepticism, what we have here is maybe some kind of reductio of Cartesian skepticism. Right? The hope that we could have is that by thinking through the problem that Kantian skepticism poses, we might be able to see what was wrong with Cartesian skepticism in the first place. And that is roughly the strategy that Hamawaki is going to pursue in this article. So, how are we going to do that? Well, one place where we could start is we could start with classic empiricism. So classic empiricism, and here one should think of people like Locke and Hume. Classic empiricism is the idea that our perceptions are just impressions that happen to us sort of passively, right? There's the mind, and the mind, it receives all these impressions, all these ideas of yellow and of certain tastes and colors and shapes and so on and so forth. And everything else, like all our thoughts and so on, are sort of built up out of these or derived out of these in certain ways that the exact story differs for every author, of course. But what doesn't differ between one author and another here is that they see the mind as a kind of theater, right, where things happen. And our self-consciousness is our awareness of what happens in this theater of the mind. Right? So as I am being here, like what I'm doing is I'm self-consciously aware of everything that happens in my mind. Right? I have some yellow, brownish patches, and I have some black patches, and I hear some ideas. Or maybe my awareness is, a lamp, a computer screen, and so on and so forth. But the basic model of my self-consciousness is awareness of what happens in this theater of the mind. And in fact, what is really nice about this awareness is that it's sort of perfect, right? I am aware of something just in case that, the vision of the mind on this theater is sort of perfect. It sees everything that happens in the mind. Here, the empiricists actually agree about a very important thing with Descartes and with the Cartesian skeptic. And that is that ideas are what they are independent of their causes. Right? I can be fully aware of what idea I have, like just sitting there, seeing the idea in this theater of the mind. And it's another question, what caused those ideas? Right? That is sort of a separate question. And that is why you see the empiricists, like Hume, for instance, the exact same problem of the external world propping up that was already there in Descartes. So Hume really worries, especially in the treatise, about whether there are physical objects and what those could be, and whether maybe, to make sense of physical objects, we should just identify them with our ideas or not. So this mind as a theater idea is something that the empiricists actually share with the Cartesians. It's like, I'm here and I'm aware of what is going on. Against this, Hamawaki presents us with a second way of thinking about self-consciousness. A way of thinking about self-consciousness that doesn't view self-consciousness as a sort of observer of what goes on in, this mental theater, but to see self-consciousness as an activity, as something that we are doing. And what Hamawaki points out, and he mentions several authors who have argued this, is that what is particular about human beings when they are conscious, right? Not when you're sleeping, or well, especially not when you're unconscious, but when you're conscious, is that it's always true that you're doing something, right? Even if you're just lazing about, or relaxing, or thinking about nothing, or letting your mind wander, those are actions, right? They might not be particularly strenuous actions, but they're actions. It means that your mental activity or your physical activity, or both of them, they fall under a description that you yourself can recognize as what you're doing, and that is only what you're doing because you yourself can recognize it as such, right? If you are sort of taking a walk through the park, well, you're only taking a walk through the park if you yourself are, ready to embrace, maybe even are already aware of, but certainly are ready to embrace this description of what you're doing. If you're not ready to embrace that, if you say, no, I'm not taking a walk through the park, I'm hurrying to my work, okay, then that's what you're doing, right? So self-consciousness is on the second model, it is a kind of activity, a kind of action. It's something that you identify with, and instead of having a perfect view of something that happens in a theater, which is the first model of self-consciousness, in the second model, you of course also know what's going on in self-consciousness, but not because you see it so well, but because you do it and you identify with it. And you wouldn't be doing it, it wouldn't count as doing it, it wouldn't count as self-consciousness if you didn't identify with it, and didn't identify with it as sort of your action under that particular description. So this second model of self-consciousness thinks of self-consciousness as activity, as self-conscious activity, obviously. And the suggestion that Hamawaki is eager to explore is that we have to think of perception as active in this sense, as not merely passive, as something that doesn't merely happen to us. And he correctly, I think, sees Kant as an ally in pursuing this thought. So, how does that work? Well, here's something that Kant says. Kant says that the relation that we have to the content of our representations is essentially first personal. So that's the way that Hamawaki phrases this. Kant himself says that the I think must be able to accompany all my representations. So our relation to the content of our representations is essentially first personal. Well, what does that mean? One way to think about it is this. You don't find out what the contents of your consciousness are. Right? It's not the case that you have a sort of third-person perspective on it, that you sort of observe what the contents of your consciousness are, and then you know it. Right? If I'm seeing a table, I don't find out that I'm seeing a table by observing myself seeing a table, or by finding in myself the state of seeing a table, or anything like that. Rather, seeing a table and knowing that I'm seeing a table, and knowing that I am seeing a table, are all the same thing. So in the very act of seeing the table, the I is already there, because there is no gap between seeing the table and knowing that I am seeing the table. The same thing is something that we can say about, let's say, believe. If I believe that Paris is the capital of France, well, I don't find out what I believe by sort of observing my behavior or observing things that sort of happen in my consciousness or something like that, right? It's not like I'm like, well, I'm really curious about what I believe about, the capital of France. Let's check it out. And so I don't know, wait a little bit, and then in my mind there pops up the sort of text, Paris is the capital of France. And I'm like, oh, hey, check it out. I believe that Paris is the capital of France. That doesn't make any sense, right? There is no gap between believing that Paris is the capital of France, and knowing that one believes that Paris is the capital of France. It is sort of an activity, not in the sense that you are always aware of this, not in the sense that it's something strenuous or that you have to choose to do it. You can't choose to do it, right? You can't sit down and think, okay, now I'm going to choose to believe that Paris is the capital of France. No. But it's something that is essentially connected to your first-person sense of yourself, right? A belief is something that you identify with, and it's only your belief because you identify with it. And you only identify with it because it's your belief, I guess. I mean, there's no gap between these two things. So, our relation to the content of our representations, whether it's, what we experience or what we believe, is essentially first personal. We know about it not because we observe it very well, but because we do it. Here's another way to make that point. Well, I guess I already made this point, but here's a nice phrase to use that Hamawaki uses to explain it. He says that, when you think that you believe something, that is not a second order belief. And what he means by that, it's not a belief about another belief. When you believe that Paris is the capital of France, that's a belief. And when you believe that Paris is the capital of France, that's not a further belief. That's not a further thing that you are aware of. It's the same thing, right? So there's no distinction really between the belief itself and the awareness of the belief, or the belief that you have to believe, and so on and so forth. The relating of the belief to yourself. It's all the same thing. So that is, I think, easy to swallow in the sense of belief. And when we talk about beliefs, it might also be relatively easy to swallow that we're active, that in a sense we are doing this ourselves. And it might be a little bit harder to see how this works in sensory experience. Now, in order to draw this link with sensory experience, which was so central to the Cartesian argument, Hamawaki is going to link sensory experience to judgment. And I'm going to read out a passage of Hamawaki's article from page 162 of this book, The Logical Alien. Sensory experience has an intentional object, brings an object before my mind only because I can give voice to it in a judgment. Sensory experience has intentional content because it plays a necessary role in the activity of bringing the objects of experience to judgment. For example, my sensory experience represents for me its object as red, triangular, and fuzzy, just in case I am aware of it as giving me a ground, a reason for judging that the object is red, triangular, and fuzzy. So what Hamawaki is claiming here is that sensory experiences have certain contents in virtue of, or maybe it's even just the same thing as, giving us reasons to believe that, that content is real, that content is there. So my sensory experience is sensory experience of a table, just in case it is a ground for me, it is a reason for me to believe that there's a table over there. Doesn't mean that it has to be sort of indefeasible, right? Maybe I can also have reasons to not believe that there's a table over there. But nothing could be a sensory experience with a particular content unless at the same time, sort of immediately, it gives me reason to judge that, that content is real, that it's over there. Sensory experience puts me in touch with objects only because, or it's putting me in touch with object is the same thing as giving me a reason to judge that the object that it puts me in contact with is real, is there, and so on and so forth. So, if that's right, if we agree that that is how we have to understand the content of, sensory episodes, the content of perception, then sensation and judgment, so what we do when we judge something to be true or judge something to be false and so on and so forth, are inextricably linked. And if we can make the case that judgment is active, then we can make the case that perception is also, in that sense, active. Might still be a passive element to it, right? I mean, we're also sort of maybe sitting back and just observing things, but there's also an active element in all judgment. Now, Hamawaki goes on to make a very important point about the notions active and passive here. So he points out that active, in this case, doesn't mean choice, right? To be active doesn't mean that you choose. You definitely don't choose to see a table. You don't choose to believe something. Active means that you have reasons, which you recognize as your reasons. I mean, something is only a reason for you if you recognize it as your reason, if you embrace it as your reason, if you take responsibility for it based on those reasons. So, to say that judgment is active, to say that it's an action to believe that Paris is the capital of France, is not to say that I've chosen to believe that Paris is the capital of France, or that I've, set out on an activity, the end point of which was that I had this belief or something like that. To say that it's an action to believe that Paris is the capital of France is to claim that I have reasons for believing that I take responsibility for that belief, that I recognize that belief as mine. That is active. And so sensibility is not something that merely happens to me, according to Hamawaki. Sensibility too, like sensation too, is something that is taken up in the activity of the mind. Right? It's taken up in the activity of the mind because I recognize these sensations as giving me reasons to hold certain judgments. So, to grasp perception as presenting an external object is to grasp it as giving me reason to believe in that external object. And so grasping perception as having certain contents and grasping perceptions as reasons for certain judgments is the same thing. And we can't understand this notion of content without this notion of the active mind that is judging. And that is why the first model of perception, the first model of self-consciousness, where, self-consciousness is just passive observation of what happens in the theater of the mind, was wrong. What we need is the second notion of self-consciousness. Self-consciousness as an activity, the kind of activity that we are ourselves responsible for, which we can paradigmatically see in judgment. But once we see that sensation, that perception is inextricably linked to judgment, that the contents of perceptions are just, what the perceptions are reasons for me to judge. And once I see all of that, I can see that perception too can only be understood once I embrace this second model of human self-consciousness and not the first model of human self-consciousness. So, what was wrong with skepticism? Well, what was wrong with skepticism is that it embraced the first model of human consciousness. Right? What was wrong with skepticism is that it thought that the human mind is a sort of passive affair. That we are there, that we have these perceptions, they happen to us, and we haven't taken any responsibility for anything yet. Right? We haven't done anything with them yet. They're not a matter of judgment yet. Now we are going to sort of think, right? Okay, do they, give us any reason to believe in this, or do they give us any reason to believe in that? And the Cartesian believes that the content, and by the way, the empiricist too, believes that the content of these perceptions doesn't depend on any of the things that I'm willing to judge based on them. And what Hamawaki suggests and what Kant suggests is that that's not true. That the content of perception is inextricably linked to this activity of the faculty of judgment, and that self-consciousness must be understood as active rather than passive, as doing something, as taking up something, taking up a responsibility, as self-identifying with something, rather than as being a passive observer. So, one final metaphor before I close this video. A final metaphor that Hamawaki gives us. He says, the senses are not external tools, right? The senses are not like measurement measurement devices. The senses are not like, let's say, a thermometer or a clock, where I can wonder, well, I mean, how good are they? Let's calibrate them. Let's check under which circumstances they work and don't work. And maybe they don't turn out to work at all, right? And then we don't use it as a measurement device. The senses are not like that, because we're not they're not external to us. Understanding ourselves as beings who are in sensory contact with the world is essential to our self-understanding. And if we were to take that away, our very conception of ourselves as rational beings who can judge would unravel and nothing would be left. It's not the case that Hamawaki has told that entire story in this article, and he doesn't claim to have told that entire story in this article. And one of the things you could do to tell more of that story is to read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, or to read, this thick book called The Logical Alien. But I think it's a very nice way to present what is at stake in some of these discussions, and to present one very interesting way of thinking about skepticism and about how to deal with skepticism. Thank you.